Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Continuing our series of signposts on the theme of idolatry, and we're looking at idolatries that exist in our culture today. So I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Well, in our previous signpost, we considered the issue of idolatry of sex and the worship of Aphrodite within our culture today. Aphrodite would have us believe that to be really happy and fulfilled, all we need are love and sex. We noted that the worship of Aphrodite is pervasive in our society. It's everywhere. In fact, Western cultures may be the most sexualized cultures the world has ever known. Today I want to explore another idolatry, one that has a very close relationship with the worship of Aphrodite. It's an idolatry that on the one hand, it competes with Aphrodite for our attention, and on the other hand, these two idolatries are very much in partnership together. Whilst Aphrodite tells us that love and sex will make us happy, the god Mammon says that what we really need to be happy is money. And you can immediately understand the close relationship between the two of them. For as we noted previously, sex is everywhere in the media because sex sells. And there is a lot of money to be made selling it or using sexual desire as a tool to sell something else, whether it's a house, a holiday, a car, a bar of chocolate, whatever it might be. There's an old saying that money can't buy you love, and that's true. However, it can certainly buy you sex. So these two idolatries are very connected. It's stating the obvious to say that modern life is all about money. The state of the economy is the issue that more than any other normally dominates discussions and determines people's voting choices in political elections. It is, in fact, one of the biggest issues of concern in the UK in 2025. No one needs to hear a politician speak about the cost of living crisis because most people are living through it. People are struggling to pay the mortgage or the heating bill or just to buy the daily essentials. Items that haven't gone up in price have reduced in size, sometimes both, so it's a double blow. I say many people because there are plenty who are untouched and untroubled by the cost of living crisis, and who might even say, what crisis? The fact is that the gap between the rich and the poor has never been wider. Money, money, money. In the end, everything comes down to money, whether you have it or not. In our society, money has taken over the all-powerful position. Throughout history, our architectural landscapes have always expressed the deepest held beliefs and longings of our civilizations. The architectural historian Spiro Kostov describes the skylines created by prominent buildings as urban signatures. The city skyline, he says, is a kind of shorthand for urban identity, and it reveals both the structures of power within the city and the values dominant within urban society at a particular point in time. So, for example, in 1746, the artist Canaletto painted London. The skyline was dominated by St. Paul's Cathedral and the spires of dozens of churches throughout the city. More than 2 centuries later, the Dome of St. Paul's remained as the outstanding landmark over the Thames and the City of London. But elsewhere, new buildings rose to prominence which imitated the classic architecture previously used to signify the sacred, while in fact they were monuments to industrial and scientific progress. St Pancras Station in London is a good example. If you look at the London skyline today, it's very different. In Canaletto's painting, the skyline is dominated by the spires and towers, which reminded citizens of a god who transcended their world. However, in the 21st century, the London skyline is now dominated by the tower blocks and skyscrapers, which assert that Mammon rules the world. Many of those towers and skyscrapers are either banks or the offices of financial institutions and global corporations. These buildings function in exactly the way that our cathedral spires used to, as symbols to indicate which gods are being worshipped in society. In the UK today, Mammon is a god to be worshipped, and he is a god who promises everything: comfort, pleasure, sex, health, the best of everything, luxurious living. If you can name it, then you can buy it, for everything and everyone has a price. Of course, as with the worship of Aphrodite, the true price Mammon exacts for our worship is less attractive, but it must be paid. And it turns out that money, like fire, is a good servant, but a bad master. What does a society that worships Mammon look like? Well, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work that out. As Tom Wright notes, like all idols, Mammon enslaves and dehumanizes not only those who worship him, but also those who are caught in his net. Societies where Mammon is worshipped are societies where the poor are despised. They obviously haven't worshipped the god properly, unlike the rest of us who have received the rewards that he offers. Societies where Mammon is worshipped are societies where millions of people are kept in debt and hundreds of people live in luxury. Societies where Mammon is worshipped are societies where the poor are punished for being poor, and where everyone is bombarded with the message that greed is good and that to be really secure, happy and fulfilled, we must have more of everything, more money and more stuff. If that's not an accurate description of our society, then I don't know what is. Millions of people in the UK are not having even their basic human needs met, with more than 5 million people now depending on food banks for essential items. And that's up from just 64,000 people in 2010. And those numbers are only for food banks that register people, like the Trussell Trust, for example. And so the actual number may be double that. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has written that in so many human crises, money plays a part. Debt and desire for things enslaves many people and draws them into lives that are in the service of Mammon, a master they neither choose nor want, but who tricks them by playing on insecurities, on good intentions, on reasonable ambitions. At a national and international level, every crisis seems to end in talk about economics. Not economics as a tool in the service of human flourishing, but as an end in itself. And the interconnectedness of governments, corporations, and financial institutions means that more power is held over individuals and nations by economics, by money, and flows of finance. Mammon gains strength through our obedience. Of course, this is nothing new. The New Testament has plenty of stories about human greed and financial exploitation of the poor and those in debt. A careful survey of the Gospels reveals that Jesus spoke about money and possessions more than any other subject. And the word that Jesus uses for money here in Matthew 6 is mammon, the Aramaic term for wealth. And by declaring that we cannot serve both God and money, Jesus personifies money as a rival god. Jesus is making it clear that money is not just an impersonal means of exchange. It is not a morally neutral resource that can be used for good or bad depending on our attitude towards it. According to Jesus and all the writers of the New Testament, behind money are very real spiritual forces that energize it and give it a life of its own. Hence, money is an active agent. It is a law unto itself, and it is capable of inspiring devotion. Money has a spiritual power to win our hearts. However, much as we try to deny the spiritual reality behind money, Jesus confronts our folly, reminding us that, like all false gods, Mammon demands our allegiance. And that is why so much of Jesus' teaching regarding wealth is evangelistic in its character. He calls people to turn away from the Mammon God in order to worship the one true God. For example, in Matthew 19, when the rich young ruler asks how he can have eternal life, Jesus tells him to go and sell everything he has and give the money to the poor. Jesus' answer only makes any sense when we understand that this young man's wealth was a rival god seeking his complete devotion. When he turned away, Jesus didn't run after him and say, "Look, I was only kidding," or that he just meant it as a metaphor for some spiritual truth. No, the reality is that money was the man's idol, and it had to be completely rejected. In Luke chapter 19, when Jesus was at Zacchaeus' home, and Zacchaeus declared he would give half his possessions to the poor and repay everyone he had defrauded 4 times what he owed. Jesus declared then that salvation had come to him. So what's the connection between those two things? Well, it's simply that Zacchaeus' action symbolized that he was turning away from worshipping Mammon to worship the true and living God. It is the very opposite of our evangelistic method. We first want to get folks saved, but whatever we mean by that term. Traditionally, and at least certainly for the last few hundred years, it means getting them to agree to a few doctrinal statements about Jesus and then saying a pre-programmed prayer. Eventually, as they integrate into the church over time, at some point we start to teach them about things like financial stewardship. Jesus, on the other hand, wants people to count the cost of discipleship before they become disciples. He wants them to understand that there are things they're going to have to give up in order to follow him, that there are idols and false gods that they're going to have to abandon in order to follow the one true God. It's not just about giving in terms of financially, but also the need to abandon all false gods, including Mammon, and all that Mammon promises. And make no mistake, that cost is steep. In Luke 14, verse 33, Jesus says, "Those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples." The key issue is one of allegiance. And for Jesus, we cannot be allegiant to him and to money at the same time, for money is an idolatry that we must be converted from in order to be converted to following Jesus. If we carefully examine what Jesus says in our text, we can begin to get a sense of the uncompromising and absoluteness of Jesus' statement. Jesus uses 3 specific words that set up a series of dualistic contrasts that force the audience to make a choice. The word translated as serve is deluin, and it can mean to serve or to be enslaved. The tense here is present infinitive active, so that would mean to serve and to go on serving, to be enslaved and to continue being enslaved. And the word translated as master is not the normal word for master, rather it's kurios, the word for Lord, and it's in the plural. The word translated as the other is heteros, which refers to someone or something that is other and of a different quality, nature, form, or class. So if we read the text again with all that in mind, we can see that Jesus is saying that there are 2 lords, God and Mammon. And as heteros suggests, we can only serve one or the other. It's impossible to serve both these lords, for they are of a completely contrasting nature, quality, and class. One is a false god and one is a true god. And furthermore, The double meaning of Deluan may be in play here, for God and Mammon are other and of different quality and nature. So whereas God demands our willing service, motivated by love and grace, those who serve Mammon will find themselves enslaved and forced to serve. Jesus offers that stark take it or leave it, no compromise choice, that we can either serve Jesus as Lord, to serve Jesus as our saving King, or be enslaved to Mammon as Lord. It's one or the other. We simply can't do both because it can't be done. Now, a word of caution. I'm not suggesting that every disciple of Jesus must sell all their possessions and give away all their money to follow Jesus. That's not what Jesus is saying here, although that may be the right thing for some people to do. And in history, some people like St. Francis have done that. Writer Richard Foster has suggested that most of us could actually probably live on about half of what we earn if we didn't spend so much selfishly on things that we don't need. And I've got to admit, he has a point. During the COVID pandemic, I was very surprised at how much money I had left over at the end of each month. And then I realised I wasn't going out to the shops and seeing things that caught my eye and go, oh, I quite like the look of that, I'll have that. You know, whether it's a new shirt or whatever, an album or something. I wasn't going out for coffee. I wasn't even buying petrol. In fact, I sold my car during COVID because I wasn't using it. The book of Acts does have stories of people who sold land and homes and gave the money to the work of the gospel. But it also has stories of people who owned land and homes and who kept them and used them for the work of the gospel. Nor am I suggesting that it's wrong to have money or goods. Contrary to popular belief, the Bible does not say that money is the root of all kinds of evil, but rather the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So maybe the issue is not so much how much money you have, but how much of you your money has. How much of a hold it has on your life. We simply cannot remain blind to the reality that money is a false god that will always demand our worship and our allegiance. And to be a Christian is to have pledged your allegiance to Jesus. And if you're allegiant to him, you can only be allegiant to him and not another god. And so we ought always to be aware of the idolatrous pull that money has and all that it brings has on our heart's affections. As Justin Welby has said, Mammon tricks us as much by playing on our good intentions and reasonable ambitions as by playing on our fears and our insecurities. And I guess this really raises a question of, well, what can I do about Mammon in my life? Mammon rules the world, it seems. It certainly seems to rule in our culture. And we need money to live. You know, you've got to have a roof over your head. You've got to have clothes on your back and food to eat and so on and so forth. What can we do about that? Well, there's several things we can do. Firstly, we must follow the example of Jesus and identify with the plight of the poor, care for the other, and have generosity in giving. These are all powerful antidotes to the lure of Mammon. It also helps us to put our own wealth in proper perspective. And most of us are wealthy, actually. You know, when I think about my childhood growing up, we were in abject poverty. And there was no welfare state at all to help us then. And yet, I have to say, when I think back to that, I wouldn't consider myself to be wealthy by any means. And yet, compared to my parents, I live like a king. See, most of us are wealthy, far more wealthy than we imagine. If you own your own home, then you are wealthier than 95% of the world's population who do not. Ultimately, we have to take seriously what the Bible says about money and possessions. And perhaps most especially, we have to obey the command of Jesus from Matthew 6, verse 33, to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. God is no man's debtor, and he has promised to provide all that we need. I remember one time I hadn't been paid for my work with some cash flow crisis, and my wages were actually 10 days being paid, late and being paid. Unfortunately, my rent still needed paid, and I was going to have to eat until I got paid. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't have anyone I could borrow money from, and even if I borrowed it, I'd have to pay it back, and so all that stuff. So I just prayed about it. And that day I went home from work, and there behind the storm door of my flat were 3 bags of groceries that kept me going until payday. And to this day, decades later, I still don't know who put them there or how they knew, other than God put it in their heart to do that. God's no man's debtor. He will provide what we need. Our problem is, I think, that we listen to Mammon whispering in our ear, and we desire much, much more than we need. And we forget that we have much, much more than we realize. And so we have to seek God's kingdom first and his righteousness, and trust that all the things that we need will be added to us. And seeking God's kingdom first means putting our wealth at the service of that kingdom. And we can only do that if we are firstly seeking to be right with God. In other words, rejecting the lordship of Mammon is only possible by pledging our allegiance to the only true Lord, Jesus Christ, our saving King. Thanks for listening.